Pack your bags, we're going on a road trip. When you think of the quintessential American road trip, you might imagine gas station snacks, never-ending highways, sprawling landscapes, and a highly curated playlist. But imagine tackling a 3,000-mile cross-country road trip with your friends without detailed maps, modern durable tires, or even paved roads. In 1909, 22-year-old Alice Ramsey did exactly that, becoming the first woman to ever drive coast to coast across the United States. Her daily mileage ranged anywhere between 4 and 198 miles, and it took her just under 2 months to complete the journey. At the time, cars were not common. Horses were the main mode of transportation, and rail travel was at its height for those that were traveling long distances. There was a minuscule amount of infrastructure for these new horseless carriages. No one had any reason to take a car across the country except for those that wanted to attempt a challenge, like Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson, who was the first person to attempt a transcontinental drive in 1903. So how did Alice's adventure come about? Lucky for us, she detailed her entire journey in a memoir titled Veil, Duster, and Tire Iron, which is the main source I'm using to recap her story. This book was published in 1961 and had a very limited print run, so it's now a rare book. The cheapest I could find it was for like $50+ on Amazon, but thanks to the public domain, digital libraries, and my college login still working 5 years later, I have the book right here. Part 1. Alice Ramsey. Alice was once described in a newspaper as a charming little woman with blue eyes and dark hair. Her nature is sweet and lovable, and she is most retiring in manner. Born November 11th, 1886, Alice grew up in New Jersey, and from a young age, she was very curious about mechanics and how things worked. By the end of grade school, she knew that instead of learning typical feminine studies, she wanted to focus her time on developing her technical knowledge. She briefly attended Vassar College for 2 years and then married in 1906 and had a child the following year. One day in 1908, she decided to take her husband's horse Duke out on a little adventure on her own, and along their jaunt, a car sped by at 30 miles an hour and it spooked the horse and it caused him to bolt. She was able to regain control of the horse, but later when she recounted this story to her husband, he thought it safer that she have an automobile instead of a horse. And he had never driven a car himself, but he bought her a red 1908 Maxwell runabout. Alice, being as skilled as she was, learned how to drive the vehicle in only 2 lessons. She was enthralled by driving, and that summer she drove more than 6,000 miles on the mostly dirt highways around New Jersey. That same year, she participated in what I think is pronounced the Montauk Run, which was an endurance race for car enthusiasts hosted by the American Automobile Association. This drive spanned about 100 miles from Lynbrook, New York to the end of Long Island at Montauk Lighthouse. Following the completion of this run in her Maxwell car, Alice was approached by another participant who was very impressed by her driving abilities. This person was Carl Kelsey, a sales manager for the Maxwell Briscoe Company. He said that she was the greatest woman driver he had ever seen and made her a proposal. Well, really more of a proclamation. She would be the first woman ever to drive an automobile across the United States of America and in a Maxwell. Carl Kelsey was always on the lookout for these promotional stunts to market the company, and this endeavor would be an all-expenses-paid trip for Alice to show that Maxwell cars could take anyone across the country. Even a woman. After some thought, Alice assembled a team of 3 other women to accompany her on her journey. Her 2 sisters-in-law, Nettie Powell and Margaret Atwood, no, not that Margaret Atwood, and her younger friend, Hermine Johns. Nettie and Maggie, as Margaret liked to be called, were both in their 40s, and as Alice said, were conservative to the nth degree. Hermine, on the other hand, was only 19 years old. Her passengers weren't very car savvy, and they didn't know how to drive, so it was solely up to Alice to complete this feat. Part 2. The plan. On behalf of Maxwell Briscoe, Alice was provided with a dark green 1909 Maxwell DA. This car had a 4-cylinder, 30-horsepower engine. For reference, today's cars sit around an average of 200, and was fully furnished with spare tubes, 2 extra tires, a tire repair kit, gasoline, and other replacement parts. Also, a standard Maxwell car at the time had a 14-gallon tank, but Alice's was fitted with a 20-gallon to make refueling a little less frequent. She didn't really talk about gas much, so I have no idea what the gas mileage was on that car and how often they had to refuel. As for the exterior of the car, there were apparently no bumpers because, as Alice put it, motorists were moderate enough in their driving habits to maintain safety without that assistance. If only that could be the case today. Headlamps were, of course, necessary to drive in the dark, especially with the lack of light outside of cities and towns. But with no electrical switch to flip them on, they had to manually light them with matches. There was also a leather-like pantasote top to help protect the passengers from bad weather, though with a lack of windows covering the sides, that could only do so much. Finally, what of the woman's personal items? They decided they could survive with one suitcase per person, but the interior of the car was very tiny. The passengers could only fit in there, so there was no place to store them. Instead, they had to wrap their luggage in a rubber sheet every morning and strap it to the back. While driving, they wore caps and simple, sturdy clothes made of this tan tweed fabric and dusters, but they also brought along a few nice city clothes for when they were not on the road. I don't have a duster, but this is the closest, like, kind of tan thing I could find to wear, so this is what we got. Appropriate garments were packed in preparation for rainy weather as well. For basic emergency meals, the company provided them with a basket of simple foods and utensils. Once the route was planned and everything was arranged, the date was set, June 9th, 1909. Newspapers were notified and published brief blurbs of the upcoming journey. And I just want to read you one of these articles from the New York Times. The headline is, "Her own mechanic on drive to Frisco. Mrs. Alice Ramsey, who will drive her Maxwell car from New York to San Francisco, has completed her plans for the trip, and on next Wednesday will start on what is probably the longest continuous trip ever taken by a woman at the wheel of a motor car. From the start to the end, Mrs. Ramsey will do the driving, and furthermore will have to make alone all tire repairs, tire changes, and such, for while she will not be alone in the car, she will be unaccompanied by man. It is this that makes the trip all the more interesting, for it will be the first time that a woman has ever attempted the long journey between the two cities under these conditions. Unassisted, she will have to pick the route, guide the car across the Rocky Mountains, and, in fact, will travel over roads and routes that would tax an expert male driver. Yet alone, she will do all this, and with confidence, too, of reaching the Pacific coast without trouble by July 16th. The official starting point of Alice's journey was 1930 Broadway, New York. Her and her team were met by a team of photographers who insisted on capturing every angle possible before they could get on the road. But thanks to them, we have these photos. There was so much excitement in the air and spirits were high, except it was pouring rain. The pantasote covering was already coming in handy, and the girls were outfitted in their rain gear. Alice said they resembled a quartet of nuns in their unflattering rubber coats, and I don't disagree. Eventually, getting impatient after dozens of photos, the girls set off. Part 3, the easy part, New York to Chicago. Before heading west, their route took them from New York City toward Albany. I'm assuming this had to do with the roads that were available at the time instead of just heading immediately west. The unrelenting weather forced them to stay at a very slow pace because it made the unpaved roads very slick, if that's even what you would call them. Alice actually described the majority of the roads as rugged trails. Only about 150 of the 3,000 plus miles they traveled were paved. They didn't need to worry about traveling too far the first day though, because they planned to stop in Poughkeepsie where Alice had gone to Vassar. 76 miles down, well over 3,000 miles still to go. When it came to finding places to stay for the night, they actually had a little outside help. The Maxwell Company tasked someone to arrive at the predetermined or estimated destination by train ahead of the girls and secure a hotel. So that was one less thing to worry about. Hamilton. Okay. This man was John D. Murphy, also known as JD. He was actually the automobile editor for the Boston Herald, so he was also acting as their publicity person, letting cities know of their upcoming arrival and connecting with local Maxwell agents to secure any parts they may need for repairs. As they ventured further west and resources became more sparse, JD started taking a pilot car to follow along with them instead of taking the train, and it was very helpful to have an extra pair of hands when in a pickle. More on that later. On day 2, they continued driving in the rain from Poughkeepsie to Albany, where they stopped for lunch, and they decided they had enough time in the day to start their drive west en route to Buffalo. They covered over 100 miles, stopping in Amsterdam for the night. 100 miles doesn't seem like a lot by today's standards, but trust me, compared to later in the trip, 100 miles was pretty decent distance for them. Now, I'm not going to detail the minutiae of the day-to-day, like what they had for dinner and every single town they passed through, and I won't mention every tire puncture and every obstacle they encountered because that occurred a lot, and I fear this would get very redundant. But those I do mention, I feel are interesting or necessary to showcase how difficult the journey was and what conditions and opinions were like in 1909. With that being said, up until day 4, they had only had minor car troubles. They had to replace a couple tire casings because they had chains on the wheels to help from sliding in the rain, and those wore the tires down. They'd stayed in Auburn the night before, still about 100 miles out of Buffalo, and when they went to leave the next morning, the car wouldn't start. It took a handful of mechanics to figure out what the issue was. It needed a new coil. But while Alice was waiting for repairs, the broken down car drew a lot of attention from people walking by because these things were a new sight. And apparently someone yelled at her to get a horse. It's just so funny that people were so anti-car back in the day, but it's also easy to see how they thought they were useless with the lack of stable roads, so it would make more sense to travel with a horse. By the time the car was fixed, it was 5:30 and their day was significantly delayed. Still, the girls were ambitious and wanted to make the 138 miles to Buffalo. Side note, I know the map miles are not accurate to what I'm saying. I am going off of what Alice said in the book, and these are probably more up to date with the modern roads, so ignore those. They managed to make it at 1:15 in the morning after driving a significant amount of time in the dark for the first time. As you can imagine, this was a little spooky with seemingly unending miles between towns and no light other than their headlamps. To celebrate the successful journey thus far without any major setbacks, the girls were able to take the next couple days off to meet with their friends who lived in Buffalo. They had dinner together, and of course they had to tour Niagara Falls, and then eventually they set off towards Cleveland. The first part of the journey through New York had been easily navigable, but things started to get more confusing as they headed west. In 1909, detailed road signs denoting where to turn to reach a certain destination were basically non-existent. Instead, they had blue books. Blue books provided decent maps, but in some cases, the maps were useless without decent signage. So, these books also had highly detailed written descriptions about where to turn with exact distances. And they denoted landmarks like railway lines and brightly colored buildings that they were supposed to turn at. For example, here's a page from a 1909 book for the Northeast Coast. To get from New York City to Albany, one of the many directions was to head straight across Drawbridge over Ship Canal to head of 230th Street, turn 90 degrees left on 230th Street to end of same at Riverdale Ave, here turn right, upgrade on Macadam.
Sorry, editing me here. Apparently it's macadam, not macadam.
Macadam is essentially a type of early paved road, and I'm assuming upgrade means going uphill. But these directions were so thorough, listing the degree of turn you had to take, what you'd see when you needed to turn, and the road names when they were available. This thing was over 800 pages long, and it's kind of incredible to think about how much time they put into making these. However, these blue books also had their faults. For one, in 1909, the blue books only covered half the country. There was practically nothing west of the Missouri River. Two, what happened if the landmarks changed? Alice and her crew actually encountered this issue as they were driving through Ohio on their way to Cleveland. She recalled that a direction said, at 11.6 miles, yellow house and barn on right. Turn left. They drove for a while and couldn't find the yellow house, so they asked a local woman which road led to Cleveland, and she said, "Oh, you passed it a mile back." It turned out the farmer that owned this house and barn was anti-automobile, and he knew his home was a landmark, so he repainted it green to confuse drivers and amuse himself. Rip, greenhoused farmer, you would have loved Impractical Jokers. They did find the correct road and completed their 198-mile journey from Buffalo to Cleveland, which ended up being the longest distance they had covered in one day on the entire trip. On the next multi-day stretch towards Chicago, they also set a new record speed for the Maxwell, 42 miles an hour. That doesn't seem fast by today's standards, but on rough, uneven roads and without a glass windshield to protect against wind and bugs, 40 miles per hour was pretty fast. Upon arrival in Chicago, the girls took a couple more days off to enjoy the city. Sorry, this is going to be a tangent, but I'm a tour guide in Chicago, and this part was just so interesting to read because it's a first-hand account of what the city was like in the early 20th century while it was still this bustling railroad hub, but also before some of its most iconic architecture was built in the 1920s, like the Wrigley Building and the Chicago Theater. Alice mentioned that for miles and miles we crossed tracks, singly, in pairs, and in groups. Back and forth we wound around and over them until we almost got dizzy and wondered if there would ever be an end. Chicago's railroads basically shriveled up in the final decades of the 20th century, but there were a few other things Alice noted that piqued my interest. She mentioned the famous tale of Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern and starting the Great Chicago Fire only about 30 years prior, which was later proven false, by the way. She also said Chicago was beginning to show signs of becoming the metropolis it now is in the 1960s. With all of the splendid new buildings, Michigan Avenue was already asphalt paved and a beautiful wide thoroughfare lined with bustling offices and stores. It's so satisfying to hear Michigan Avenue described in that way so long ago because it's still like that today, though this was still 40 years before the time of the Magnificent Mile. Anyways, the crew used their time in Chicago as an opportunity to freshen up and have their laundry done, as well as to spectate an automobile race. By this point, it had been 14 days since the start of the trip, so I believe it was June 23rd, and they'd completed 1/3 of the drive to San Francisco. Leaving Chicago, they drove through miles of Midwest farmland on their way toward Iowa's Cedar Rapids. They weren't able to make it to their intended destination for the night due to another flat tire, but this let Alice show off her mechanical expertise to her crew and the watching men who insisted that they help. She denied their help, except when it came to the part she hated, blowing up the tire. A queen knows how to show off her skills without overexerting herself. Keep in mind, these women were also doing all of this in thick skirts. They stayed in Rochelle that night, and the next day, they finally reached the official entrance into the West, the Mississippi River. Alice was rightly intimidated by the width of the river and the massive bridge spanning it, but they crossed it into Iowa without any issues and were eager to start on the next phase of their journey. Part 4, into the West, Iowa to the Missouri River. Iowa proved to be a beast of its own. The next goal was to reach Cedar Rapids within the day, which seemed very possible because it was only about 85 miles away from where they'd crossed the Mississippi at Clinton. As they began their drive into the state, the roads weren't much different from what they'd experienced in rural Illinois with endless plains, and they were making pretty great time until they encountered another storm and they were forced to stop in Mechanicsville. They hid the car in a stable and attempted to wait it out, but after 2 hours of torrential downpour, they decided to call it at night and found a hotel about 25 miles from their goal. They were able to chug on the next day, not until waiting out another storm, and a Maxwell representative from Cedar Rapids was able to drive out to them and lead the best way through the incessantly muddy roads. Dealing with nonstop rain and the road conditions throughout the previous days, Alice was rightly distracted and forgot to check on essential parts of the car, like the fuel tank. She mentioned her policy was to keep the gasoline tank at least half full, but the car didn't have a fuel gauge, so you couldn't easily check how much was left. So they had to physically measure how much was in the tank. The tank was located under the front seat cushion, so they had to remove that, then put a measuring stick into the tank and then approximate the remaining value based on how many inches the liquid rose. On this occasion, everyone completely forgot about the fuel tank and they ran out of gas. Luckily, the person leading them to Cedar Rapids was able to walk to a farm they had passed about a mile back and used their phone to call someone to bring them gas. They finally made it to Cedar Rapids and decided to stay there for the night despite the short distance that they had covered. They had hoped the drive would improve from there and said goodbye to their pilot car, but conditions throughout Iowa only got worse. Roads were still incredibly muddy from the storms, which was kind of like a thick soup for the car's tires to churn through, and this overworked the car and caused the radiator to overheat. The radiator functions to keep the engine cool, and these days coolant in radiators is usually a mix of water and antifreeze, which raises the boiling point of water and keeps it from boiling and evaporating. However, back then, the coolant was usually just plain old water. So with the overheating engine, the water got too hot, boiled, and ran out. They didn't have any more water with them, and they were miles from the next town, so they thought they were stranded. Well, while the rainy conditions were what put them in this situation in the first place, there was a lot of water in the ditches from the storms. Though they didn't have any sort of bucket or large container to transport the water from the ditch to the car. The only containers they could find were these little, very beautiful cut glass jars that Nettie and Maggie had in their luggage for toiletries. But it was better than nothing, so the two sisters started crouching down into the ditch with their tiny little jars. They would fill them up, take them to the car, pour them in, and then they had to repeat that process countless times. After a while, they were able to fill it up a decent amount and they were able to move on. However, the roads didn't improve and they encountered the same issue. Actually, they ran out of water 3 more times before they were able to make it to the next village to restock their water supply. I can't imagine having the patience for that. Now, you might be thinking, was there anything being done to try to improve the roads at the time? Yes, but very slowly. A good roads movement began in the 1880s with a goal to improve roads in rural areas, pushing state and national governments to provide the funds for it. The movement was actually started by a group of cyclists, since there were even fewer cars in the 1880s. And in 1892, the League of American Wheelmen, which was a group of cyclists, began publishing the Good Roads magazine to promote the need for quality public roads. Within 3 years, this magazine was circulated to over 1 million people. Roads gradually improved throughout the decades, and in the 20th century, the movement transitioned to focusing more on cars as they became more popular. And eventually, this led to the development of cross-country highway systems, which followed many of the original roads. Actually, the road that Alice and her crew were following through Iowa and much of the Midwest was the precursor to the Lincoln Highway. This was developed in 1913 and was the first coast-to-coast highway in the country, stretching from Times Square in New York City to the farthest west corner of San Francisco. From there, the highways continued to grow and expand. Alice felt that she was the mother of the Lincoln Highway, and I agree that she should hold that title. She was a pioneer not just for a woman, but for the entire United States road system. This is a small detail, but as they carried on, they met a woman in a rural area who was sitting at a corner with a wagon and her horses, and naturally they stopped and chatted, and this woman inquired if they were the women that were driving across the country. Turns out this woman in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, had read about them in the newspaper and traveled 6 miles to witness them pass by on their historic trip. I have no idea how long she was waiting there, but that is dedication. Later, they encountered what should have been a small creek, but due to the rains, the creek was overflowing and the bridge over it was inaccessible. They attempted to see if they could cross directly through the water, but quickly knew the water level was too high. So with no other accessible route to their knowledge, they decided to wait and see if the water would recede. In the meantime, they made a makeshift dinner. Despite the sparseness of the western states, the girls never really went hungry. Their meals weren't the most substantial half the time, but they made do. Alice mentioned that food in general across the country was fair, sometimes poor. Whenever it became too sketchy, we could always get along by eating a slice or two of bread with the addition of butter and sugar for nourishment and energy. Sometimes they met kind strangers who offered them a home-cooked meal, which they gladly accepted. Other times they didn't have a chance to get food at all because they didn't pass through any towns, so they would eat leftover fruit. In this case, the remaining food was limited, so Hermine walked to a farm to ask for bread and water, which they gave to her in exchange for a quarter. That's nearly $8.90 today, which is a little much for bread and water even by today's standards, so they did not cut her a bargain. When the sun began to set, the water level had hardly receded, so they made camp for the night and had to sleep in the car. This, of course, did not allow for much privacy with the open car, but they did what they could. They put the top up and pulled the windshield down to protect against wind, and the 4 women slept very uncomfortably. The space in the car was already limited as is, and there was no chance to lie down, and Alice, sitting in the driver's seat, had even less space with the steering wheel jabbing into her abdomen, so she propped her feet up on the dashboard and rested her head against the painfully hard top of the seat. The next morning, they awoke around 4 to find the water level had gone down considerably, so they were able to cross and made it to Belle Plaine to have a proper meal. I'm sure you're sensing a pattern here that once one issue was resolved and seemed okay, that respite was short-lived for the women. Due to all of the moisture in the air, next, the ignition system failed. But this was an easy fix for Alice, disassembling and cleaning off a faulty spark plug. And just when they thought the Iowa skies were clear of rain for the rest of the drive across the state, they hit a storm again. Luckily, the team made it to Boone before the storm really set in. They still had about 150 miles to go until they reached their next major milestone, Omaha, Nebraska. And at this rate, it looked like those 150 miles were going to take a long time to traverse. There were many men in the hotel hotel they stayed in who inquired about the trip and were all too willing to provide unsolicited advice, though they did have knowledge about what the roads ahead were like. They told Alice the roads wouldn't get any better throughout the state and they should ship the car the rest of the way to Iowa and continue to drive from there. Well, that would have defeated the entire purpose of the trip. Alice held strong and thought that would have been cheating, so she was determined to carry on as planned. Alice and her team did choose to heed one warning, though. Throughout their journey, they had heard about Danger Hill, which was on the next part of their route. This was an infamous hill to locals. It was so steep that, because many car fuel tanks at the time relied on gravity to move gas to the motor at the front, it was common for people to ascend the hill backwards to allow the gas to flow the correct way. This itself didn't seem like much issue for the crew. However, many were concerned about the total weight of the car, passengers, and gear being too much to successfully make it up the muddy slope. So instead of shipping the car to Omaha, they decided to ship the passengers and their luggage. But Alice wouldn't be driving alone. They decided their trusty sidekick, JD, would come along with her to assist with any trouble along the way. The next day, the woman took the train to Omaha, and Alice and JD left Boone by 1 p.m. But they only made it to Jefferson by 4 that afternoon after being towed out of one of, spoiler, many holes they were yet to encounter. Shortly after leaving Jefferson the next day, they encountered the notorious Danger Hill. The reason this hill was so difficult wasn't necessarily because of its height, which was about 150 feet, or its grade, but because of, 1, the road conditions, duh, and 2, the road up the hill had a tight S-curve to negotiate, as well as a 90-degree turn at the bottom to start the ascent, which prevented cars from gaining any momentum before making the climb. But Alice and JD not only successfully conquered Danger Hill, but someone had gotten stuck ahead of them, and Alice's Maxwell was able to tow them up with a rope. Talk about strong marketing for that motor. Alas, the roads did not improve, and they encountered many more big, muddy holes from the storms. Alice expertly dodged them for a while, but inevitably the car got lodged in one, and they were once again stuck. No one was around, and this hole was rather deep, but luckily JD was there. There was a pile of fence rails on the side of the road, and so JD took one of these and used it to leverage the back side of the car out while Alice pressed the gas and moved forward, which apparently drenched JD in mud. They came upon VIII, which had been hit by a huge flood 2 days prior, and the lower part of the town was basically inaccessible. Seeing this, they spoke to the locals about the upcoming roads, and they didn't think Alice and JD would be able to get past Denison with the flood conditions. So Alice and her team had to regroup. Without a phone to notify them, they left the Maxwell and VIII and took a train to meet the girls in Omaha to discuss a new plan. The women were very surprised to see Alice arrive without the car, but after consulting her team, they decided that it was best to give up the whole idea of driving through Omaha and instead to take the automobile from VIII to Denison, thence northwestward to Sioux City, where the conditions were better. From there, they would cross the Missouri River into Nebraska and make their way back onto their original planned route at Columbus. With the plan agreed on and set, Alice and JD took the train back to VIII, while the girls chose to take the train to Sioux City and regroup there the next day. Or so they hoped. Next day at this point meant sometime in the next 3 days. It seems, though, that the rest of the country thought absolutely nothing had gone wrong so far, and they were perfectly on time, with the Newark Star going so far as saying, "Mrs. Ramsey is driving on schedule and in Omaha was on time." Yeah, she stopped in Omaha, but she didn't drive through Omaha. She definitely didn't arrive on time. Moving on. As planned, Alice and JD set out in the morning, but they could hardly even make it 3 miles before the rear axle on the car broke and they couldn't move. They were able to get in contact with a Maxwell agent in Sioux City who was able to ship out an axle, but it wouldn't arrive until 7 in the morning the next day. So they were stranded yet again. Someone from Denison was able to sit in the car overnight to keep watch while Alice and JD went to a hotel. And the next morning, they got to the car early to fix it as soon as possible, only to learn it had been lost by an inexperienced express agent and couldn't possibly get there before evening. It just didn't end. See what I mean about the next day taking 3 days? But finally, eventually, the axle was repaired and they were able to reunite with the other 3 women and made it to Sioux City on Friday, July 2nd. Their plan was to get to Columbus by July 5th, where they would resume their original route. I want you to take a wild guess and see if they were able to make it to Columbus by the 5th. Foreshadowing. In Sioux City, Alice took the opportunity to rid the car of its caked up mud and gave it a thorough cleaning, and the women did the same with themselves. They actually took off one extra day in the city for washing and laundry. After a day's rest, they were more than ready to carry on, but it began to pour again in good old Iowa fashion, as Alice said. And she also mentioned that inside of an hour, so much rain had fallen, it was inadvisable to think of going that day. So they waited, and guess what? The next day, it was still raining incessantly, so they stayed another night. At this point, it was already the 5th, and Alice was getting fed up with the rain and was determined to go on the next day, rain or shine. They would finally cross the Missouri River into Nebraska and get the heck out of Iowa. Part 5. Will the roads ever improve? Sioux City to Cheyenne. Eventually, the rain subsided on the 6th, but they had to deal with the post-rain conditions. A Sioux City Maxwell rep attempted to lead the team through the worst of the roads, but his car broke down and he couldn't move. Impatient to get a move on, the girls were determined to continue forward without a guide. They at least had a team of horses tow them through that bad section of road. That day, being so anxious to gain some mileage after being stuck in Sioux City for so long, they only made it 13 miles to Jackson. This improved slightly the next day, achieving 36 miles in 12 hours. When they finally reached the state's western border, they'd been in Iowa for nearly 2 weeks. In Alice's words, 13 days had been consumed getting across its 360 miles of gumbo from east to west. They were ready to be out of rain-ridden Iowa, but it turned out Nebraska wasn't any better. Very quickly, they had to be towed out of 2 holes in the distance of a mile. On this entire trip, they had usually encountered very kind strangers who were willing to help them out of their predicaments, but that wasn't quite the case this time. This time, they recruited a farmer to help pull them out, but he would only do it for a fee. Well, the second time they got stuck, the farmer doubled the price. Alice said, "It was well for us there were no more puddles in that vicinity if he figured on working with such mathematics." This guy clearly never heard about chivalry, but I suppose you gotta make that dough where you can. Later that day, they encountered a long, slippery hill that the Maxwell would not have been able to climb without unloading some of its weight. Here they met much kinder strangers with horses who offered to carry the 3 passengers up the hill to relieve the weight while Alice piloted the Maxwell up. I wasn't going to include this little interaction initially, but I wanted to use it to point out how the 3 girls got out of the car many times, and they didn't officially make the journey across the country by car, because they knew this was Alice's achievement to secure. And with that being said, Alice could have copped out so many times and had someone else drive the car for her through the difficult spots while she sat back on a wagon and watched them struggle, but she didn't. She was determined to stay in that car the entire time it was moving, even when it was being towed. And the girls respected that, and they didn't try to talk her out of it, and I just love the endurance and the companionship of this team. As the troop continued, they remained relatively positive despite the numerous setbacks. "Surely we will reach Columbus tomorrow," we sighed each night, according to Alice, though the highway was slowly improving as they moved further west from the Missouri River. After more car troubles, which Alice expertly fixed, they finally made it to Columbus by lunchtime. They had hoped to complete the 120-mile drive between Sioux City and Columbus in a single day, but it ended up taking about 3. Instead of staying in Columbus that night, the girls wanted to make up for lost time, so they carried on to Grand Island, completing a whopping 92 miles that day. Apparently, the Nebraska roads were becoming more gravelly, which made the terrain easier to grip, and they were able to pick up some speed. The next milestone was Cheyenne, Wyoming, over 350 miles away. Amped up by their mileage the day prior, they left Grand Island with the mindset to cover even more distance. They made it all but 4 miles before part of their rear axle broke, and they were forced to stay in Grand Island another day and a half. It's funny hearing about how incredibly long this journey took them compared to today, but then seeing Alice think the same thing about the travelers before her. She mentioned this was the old overland stage route of years ago, and we could not help thinking how much slower was their travel than ours, which is valid. The Overland Trail was an old wagon route in the 19th century, which I believe started in Kansas, ran through southern Nebraska, and then continued west to California. This route was widely used for mail transport and migrants moving west before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Before the railroad, people were able to cover maybe 20 miles a day tops, taking over 5 months to cross 2,000 miles. So Yeah, travel took significantly longer, half a century before Alice's journey, even with her delays. A couple days later, they were coming up on Ogallala. I should have checked these pronunciations before I recorded the video, but it's Ogallala, not Ogallala. Ogallala makes much more sense. That's how it's written, it sounds wrong. When they were coming up on this town, they had seen a group of men and horses signaling for them to stop. They hadn't encountered an obstruction like this before, so they asked a man what was going on, to which he replied, "Oh, just a little murder." And that was it. They had accidentally stumbled across an active manhunt, and the girls were being held suspect. They sat there for 2 hours until the group let them pass, and the delay forced them to stay there for the night. They came to find out a guy named Raleigh Mann had been robbed and murdered in his cabin, and later a couple had been found spending a ton of money in a neighboring town. They were arrested and found guilty. I tried digging for a newspaper article on this for hours, and I couldn't find anything. I don't know if the town was too small or what, but anyways, within the next few days, they crossed into Wyoming and encountered a new, less severe obstacle. The trail to the state's capital crossed directly through private lands and ranches, and there were fences and gates on the property borders to keep all of the cattle contained. They were able to pass through these just fine, but they had to constantly get out of the car to open and close these gates to make sure the cattle didn't get out. I've experienced this a couple times in the middle of Montana, and I'm sure that would get really annoying after a while. Though I suppose that is nothing compared to the other hurdles they have faced. Speaking of hurdles, I never even thought about how they went to the bathroom or dealt with periods on this trip until I finished writing this script. Yeah, nature was plentiful for them to use, but I could not imagine dealing with cramps and cleanliness with the kinds of period products they had back in the day. But anyways, moving on to part 6, the Wild West, Cheyenne to Salt Lake City. When they made it to Cheyenne, Alice thought it looked like a true frontier town. She said it was nevertheless a typical one with a conglomeration of Indians, cowboys, and cattlemen on the streets. The buildings of frame construction and the dirt streets strongly resembled the sets we see nowadays for westerns on TV. But that was about the most they would see until their next destination of Salt Lake City, which was about 400 miles away. Alice noted that roads in Wyoming were scarcely what we would designate as such. They were wagon trails, pure and simple. At times, mere horse trails. They'd encountered basic trails many times during this trip, so that was no problem. However, with a lack of human-made infrastructure around, navigation became pretty difficult. With no signboards and not too many telegraph poles, it was an easy matter to pick up a side trail and find oneself arrived at the wrong destination. In addition, there were very few towns and they were all very far apart. So Maxwell reps from Cheyenne insisted that the women have pilot cars to lead them through the most barren areas. On the stretch, they began climbing into the Rocky Mountains, and with the steep hills, they had to stop pretty frequently to cool the motor. Though the unique rock formations were unlike anything the woman had seen before, so they used these pauses to marvel at the scenery. Being from the flat Midwest, I understand how stunning the mountains are when you see them for the first time, and I actually did a road trip from Chicago to LA last year, and the views from some of those roads, especially Colorado and Utah, are breathtaking. I literally could not stop saying wow the entire time, but this story isn't about me. They stayed in Rock River that night after traversing nearly 90 miles. The pilot team proved to be very useful as there was hardly any road for them to follow. However, they also set the woman back a little bit. Wyoming had many irrigation ditches to cross over, and the pilot car got stuck in a rather deep one. After having experienced pulling out another car earlier in the trip, Alice assumed a similar strategy to before. She crossed the ditch at a shallower point and hooked up a rope to each car and then put it in reverse and yanked them out. They also encountered many arios. Nope, not arios, arroyos, which are essentially temporary dried up riverbeds in deserts. When it rains, these become channels for water to flow, and they get cut deeper and deeper over time. They came across one that was at least 60 feet deep, creating a very steep incline to climb down and then back out of with a practically tractionless surface. To navigate this, everyone but Alice got out of the car. If I'm deciphering this correctly, the girls placed big rocks or wood planks behind the rear wheels, and then Alice would give the car a little gas to move it forward, and then the girls would put the rocks or wood back, and then that would kind of one, stop the wheels from moving back, but also kind of give it something to push off of, and then they would keep doing that inch by inch, so it took them forever. Now, at one of their previous stops, they had learned that the bridge they planned to take across the Platte River had been washed out by a flood, so they would have to take an alternate route across a railroad trestle near Fort Steele. And to cross this trestle by car, they had to obtain a permit upon arrival to make sure that there was no train coming when they were going to cross. Seemed a little sketchy, but easy enough. However, when they arrived at the trestle, they realized the place that they had to get the permit at was 3/4 of a mile away on the other side of the river. Convenient. Their only option at this point was for the three women to get out and cross the trestle by foot, obtain the permit, and then signal to Alice when she could cross with the car. This trestle was about 20 feet or so up on an embankment, and the last section was directly over the rushing water of the river. So this wasn't a mentally easy feat for any of them. The railroad ties were slippery to walk on with a lot of sand, and if another train was coming while the girls were walking on the tracks, they were out of luck. And Alice doesn't mention it, but her pilot cars must have been with her at the time, and I have no idea what they were doing in this situation. Not that the women couldn't do it on their own, but geez, maybe they weren't there. I don't know. Either way, the girls made it across without a hitch, but Alice had to wait another hour for the signal that she was good to go. Then she moved her car onto the track, and let me just read you this paragraph to really give you the sense of how perilous this part was. The wheels on the left side of the auto must travel in between the two rails, the ones on the right on the outside of the right hand rail, between it and the edge of the bank. This, being of sandy surface, had to be carefully negotiated. One could easily get too close to the edge and slip over the brink and down the bank. Remember too that there was practically no ballast, and the design the Maxwell must travel was like a Greek fret, which she had written was kind of like a da 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 da. So like literally just bouncing. 3/4 of a mile of this, one bump at a time. There are more bumps in that distance than you would imagine. Yeah, it doesn't sound like an enjoyable part of the journey. And this jolting apparently took a massive toll on her body, and she briefly thought she had appendicitis due to the amount of pain she was in after, but it quickly subsided after some rest. They achieved 81 miles that day, staying in Rollins for the night, where they switched out for another less experienced pilot. I mentioned earlier that the Blue Books were handy for navigating roads in the east, but there weren't many navigation resources for west of the Missouri River. Alice said that while steering through the west, many times we found our correct route by following poles which carried the greater number of wires. Most of the time we were right, yet there were occasions when we chose the wrong direction and were obliged to retrace our way to the intersection and try again. That's why the local pilots were useful, because they should know the terrain pretty well. Well, this new pilot did not seem to know where he was going in this expanse of nothingness. Apparently he accidentally led the girls to the entrance of a mine and then to a sand pit. Regardless of the detours, they racked up another 80 miles that day and stayed in Opal for the night, which sounded glamorous. Despite the sparseness of the country at the time, the girls seemed to have decent luck finding accommodations for the night, no matter how small the town was. With the exception of the night they were stranded by the overflowing river and another future event I'll mention later. Alice said that hotels in small places were rather sketchy, but rooms had been clean. The standard procedure was for Alice and Hermine to share a room, and then Nettie and Maggie shared another. On this particular night, Hermine woke up at 2 a.m. itching. Alice took a lamp to the bed and found there were bed bugs everywhere. So they went to the front desk to speak with the night clerk, only to find out there wasn't one. In place of a night clerk to check in arriving travelers, they had a chalkboard that listed all of the unoccupied rooms, and then people could see which rooms were available and just walk into one. This was insanely sketchy, especially because the hotel apparently lost all of the keys a long time ago, so they could walk into where the girls were sleeping. But the two girls ended up sleeping on the office chairs with their heads on the desk, and luckily, Nettie and Maggie did not encounter the bedbugs. They gratefully left Opal the next morning, and as they were filling up on gas, a party of 3 in a brand new car pulled up beside them. There were very few brand new cars in the West, so they started chatting, and they learned that this group had just bought a new car in Buffalo and were driving it back to their hometown of Salt Lake City. Still in barren terrain, they all thought it best for them to travel together to the city. Part 7. Are we out of the desert yet? Salt Lake City to Reno. The new edition was noted as the Thompson Party. They reached Salt Lake City pretty swiftly after that, and it was an opportunity for a much-needed rest. The women received mail from their loved ones, and Alice had the Maxwell cleaned and repaired for what might be the hardest part of its journey so far as climbing and heat were concerned, according to Alice. They ended up staying for 3 days, hosted by the Thompson Party, and enjoyed the sights of the city, like swimming in the Great Salt Lake and enjoying the amusements at the famed Saltaire Resort. Saltaire actually still exists today, but not nearly in the way it used to. Owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Salt Lake and Los Angeles Railway Company, that's a mouthful, Saltaire was meant to be a kind of Coney Island of the West. The first iteration was situated on the south end of the lake and opened in 1893. This resort had a huge dance floor and hosted bands and orchestras and provided other live entertainment. It was sold by the church in 1906 and was redeveloped and rebuilt following multiple fires, the Great Depression, and a couple world wars. And the third and current iteration was built in the 80s in an airplane hangar about a mile away from the original location. It used to be on the water, but the lake has receded so significantly that the surrounding area is just completely dry. The building now operates as a concert and event venue. The depictions of the original structure that Alice would have visited looked stunning, but now it looks like a Chuck E. Cheese version of the Taj Mahal. The girls enjoyed their time off, but the journey must continue. Leaving behind the Thompson Party, they picked up a few more pilots to escort them to Reno, Nevada. This next section was dry desert with nothing but prairie dogs and their pesky little holes they like to pop out of. And yet another unfortunate turn of events, the Maxwell hit one of these many holes. This broke a tie rod and snapped a spring seat from an axle, which caused the front wheels to splay out in opposite directions, thus hindering any further movement. They were able to make a temporary fix with some wire, and they drove very slowly to Orr's Ranch, where someone from the pilot team made a slightly better temporary fix with a strip of heated steel. They were considerably delayed that day, but everyone in the party wanted to get through that stretch of barren desert, so they continued on throughout the night. They had left Salt Lake City at 10 in the morning on Saturday, and they didn't stop to sleep until 3 Sunday morning. But with no hotel around, they had to sleep out in the open. Alice was especially exhausted and didn't really recall everyone's sleeping arrangements, but she just knows that she woke up to lying on one of the Maxwell seat cushions on the ground. But the slumber did not last very long, and 3 hours later, they were back on the road at 6 a.m. After leaving the Midwest, they'd dealt with few storms throughout the trip, but inevitably they encountered a couple summer rains, which posed new threats on the dry terrain. Later that day, they encountered a gaping hole, fully 12 feet broad and 3 to 4 feet deep, still partially filled with swiftly flowing water. They had the 2 pilot cars attempt the hole first, and both made it successfully across, so Alice followed. Well, the temporary fix on the axle did not hold up, and the front wheels splayed out again. The team set to work trying to leverage and push the car to the other side of this hole, but it was taking forever, and it was already evening, so they sent one car ahead to try to find accommodations for the night. Though they returned pretty quickly with the unfortunate report that there was another worse hole only 6 miles ahead. With that news, they ended up pulling the Maxwell through the hole to the other side and just left it there for the night and took the other 2 cars back to Calo, where they had dinner. They decided that a few of the Salt Lake City reps would go back to the city and order an axle to be shipped from San Francisco, which would arrive by train at the nearest station 90 miles away. So the earliest the axle could get to Calo was Thursday afternoon. It was Sunday. There was nothing else they could do, and with literally nothing to do in Calo for half the week, the 3 women decided to go ahead to Ely, Nevada, and wait there. Alice, however, was stuck in this small town with one of the Salt Lake City reps. Desperate to not just sit around, they happened to find a blacksmith in the area who was able to fix the issue the night before the shipment arrived. But since they were still there, they decided to wait for the axle anyways, only for it not to show up on Thursday. So good thing for the blacksmith. They finally left and made it to Ely 2 days later, where the rest of the team was waiting. Each state seemed to have its own unique obstacle. Iowa had the rain and muddy roads, Wyoming had its irrigation ditches, and Nevada was just empty. I know I had said they had gone through sparse land before, like multiple times before, but apparently this was even worse. Alice said that at the time, the state was 7th in area, and the population of the entire state was around 80,000, less than a small city and 48th in the nation. This led to numerous difficulties navigating, especially because there was absolutely no one around to ask. They had to backtrack multiple times, which caused even more delays to the trip. But eventually, they made it to Reno, grateful to see human activity and city lights. There they met with the last set of Maxwell representatives who would lead them on through the final leg of their journey to San Francisco. Part 8, the final stretch. Reno to San Francisco. The end was almost in sight, but there were still more than 200 miles to go. They made their way for California, heading into the Sierra Nevada mountains. These winding, steep trails were often traversed by very strong animals like horses or oxen, but Alice was hugely impressed with how well the Maxwell motor held up in comparison. She noted that some parts of the car were more subject to wear and tear, like the tires and axles, showing evidence of not having reached full perfection in manufacture, but the motor was remarkably adequate to meet the exacting demands of that grueling endurance test. So while the roads throughout the country were not ready for cars yet, Maxwell sure proved their engines could withstand even the toughest terrain. Their first night in California, they stayed on Lake Tahoe after covering 70 miles in 8 hours. Next was Placerville, Placerville. Then they could have finished the journey the next day, but they would have arrived after dark, which wasn't ideal for press. So they spent the eve of their arrival in Hayward. This was it. The true final stretch. They had only 20 miles between them and the ferry at Oakland, which would take them across the bay to San Francisco because there was no bridge at the time. The 20 miles went smoothly, and after getting onto the ferry, the women all got out of the car to enjoy the views. This was the one time Alice wasn't in the car while it was moving because they wanted to take in the approach to the final destination. Driving off the ferry in San Francisco, they arrived to a crowd of cars honking their horns in greetings and congratulations. The four women drove up Market Street along with their parade and completed their journey at the St. James Hotel on August 7th, 1909. Alice had driven more than 3,800 miles in 59 days. Based on what she mentioned in her book, during the journey, the car broke down at least 12 times. She had to replace or fix 7 tires, and they got stuck in a hole at least half a dozen times. And that's just what she wrote. And despite all of this, she was never undeterred. While, according to the New York Daily Tribune, the estimated goal had been to reach San Francisco by July 16th, the trip was never about speed, and arriving 22 days later did not affect this momentous achievement. Everyone celebrated with a full-blown reception that lasted well into the night, and the press made sure to document the end of this historic journey. Part 9, the press. The next day, the Associated Press published a blurb on the woman's achievement, which appeared in major newspapers all over the country with varying levels of accuracy. They must have given the wrong starting date because many of the ones that came from AP say they began on June 5th instead of the 9th, but that's a minor detail. But others, like the New York Daily Tribune, were just straight up wrong, saying she left this city in a Maxwell car on July 13th and arrived at San Francisco on August 14th. They left on the 9th, arrived on the 7th. This is just me being picky. They also wrote that, according to Ramsey, the state of Ohio was the only one which presented real hardships in the way of bad roads. It's Iowa. And actually, another newspaper said the same exact line, but said Iowa. These little details don't really matter. But anyways, the most lengthy article I could find on the journey was in the Oakland Tribune, which published a photo of Alice and the woman in the car with the headline, "Plucky Woman Motorist Completes Long Journey." The newspaper stated, "For 2 whole months, this plucky little woman has been at the wheel of her durable little car, enduring car and enduring driver, each day conquered new obstacles." Beside this was an ad for Maxwell, which spoke of Alice's success while emphatically mentioning Maxwell. Maxwell, simplicity and reliability again proven. In a Model DA touring car, Mrs. Ramsey drove her Maxwell car from New York to San Francisco over the worst possible roads, over steep grades, and made the trip, one of the most grueling imaginable, without a particle of car trouble. A trip far more difficult than the Glidden or any other tour, and finished yesterday with a perfect score. No mountains or grades too difficult for the Maxwell. No gumbo too thick, no sand too deep for the Maxwell. The only car for long or short tours. The car for a lady to drive. It is simply perfect and perfectly simple. The article also mentioned their post-trip plans. Apparently Alice was to return home in a few days, and her car was being shipped by express, so they didn't have to make the drive all the way back. She must have caught the train from Los Angeles back to New York because the Los Angeles Express wrote of her passing through for 2 hours just before returning home. They also said no adjustments of any importance were made on the machine after it left the East, which was not entirely true according to Alice's story, but you know, the media wants to sensationalize things, so it went perfectly. Other newspapers like the North Adams Evening Express really hyped the woman up, saying she encountered all kinds of roads in the western states, but proved that even on such a hard tour, the assistance of a male mechanic was not necessary, making all tire and other road adjustments herself. While she did require a mechanic a couple times for tools that she didn't have access to, it's true that she did basically everything on the road by herself, and I'm really glad they were giving her the proper credit that she deserved. Part 10. Woman Motorist of the Century. With this historic record set so early in Alice's life, what did she do after? Well, her love of driving did not cease. She eventually moved to Covina, I think that's how it's pronounced, California, outside of Los Angeles, and drove back and forth across the country more than 30 times throughout her life. She was able to see the evolution of auto travel from its very humble beginnings to the development of the modern highway system. In 1960, she was invited to attend the 43rd National Automobile Show in Detroit, where she was presented with a plaque deeming her the Woman Motorist of the Century by the American Automobile Association. She also received a letter which stated, "It is not given to many among us to play an identifiable role in changing the course of human history, but it is evident that you did just that at the wheel of a motor car when you drove it coast to coast more than half a century ago. That trip through an all but trackless land helped mightily to convince the skeptics that automobiles were here to stay, rugged and dependable enough to command any man's respect, gentle enough for the daintiest lady. For all these reasons, we declare you to be our first lady of automobile travel." She went on to publish her memoir in 1961 at the age of 74 and lived for 22 more years. She passed on September 10th of 1983 at 96 years old. What a remarkable life. In 2000, Alice became the first woman to ever be inducted into the Automobile Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame was established in 1939, so this was long overdue. And what of her companions? At the time of writing her memoir in 1961, she noted that only one of my companions of the road is now living, Nettie Powell Lewis, who has passed her 101st birthday. Nettie ended up passing the following year, and her obituary mentions her participation in the drive, and it seems she stayed in Hackensack along with her sister Maggie. Maggie also lived a long life, passing at the age of 84. I couldn't find much on these women otherwise. On the other hand, Hermine Johns, 19 at the time of the drive, became Hermine Dudley and was the mother of a composer, Margaret Purcell, and choreographer Jane Dudley. According to the New York Times, she taught for more than 20 years in ethical culture schools and at the Conservatory for Progressive Music Education in New York. She passed away in 1954 at the age of 63. For Alice, they were the best of companions. Alice said, "It is an honor to report that no one ever suggested quitting or showed any attitude other than the desire to attack the formidable situation and conquer it. They knew my intention of driving the automobile from one coast to the other, so they refrained from even asking at any point of the journey if they might take the wheel. And together, they went down in history." But the story doesn't end there. Part 11. Recreating Alice's Drive. On June 9th, 2009, a 34-year-old Emily Anderson set out to recreate Alice's Drive in a replica 1909 Maxwell DA, built nearly from scratch. She was accompanied by her co-pilot Christy Catania, who operated as the car's blinkers and mirrors. Alice's grandson and great-grandson even came along on the first day. With the improved roads came speedier cars, which were passing them at 70 miles an hour. The Maxwell's top speed was still only 40. Emily told the New York Times that the drive was physically exhausting, especially without power steering, and the constant vibrations from the steering wheel for 8+ hours a day was very interesting to deal with. Emily and Christy definitely encountered their fair share of mechanical issues, but they halved the time it took Alice, completing the journey in 30 days thanks to modern highways. Part 12. Final thoughts. I know that Alice would be very proud to know that someone recreated her drive and that her story is still being recognized today. She's a pioneer of automotive travel for the entire country, but she knew how important her accomplishment was for future generations of women drivers, finishing her memoir by declaring that her journey was a prelude to the thousands of women drivers who would later make the same trip in much shorter time from Hell Gate to the Golden Gate. Thank you, Alice, and thank you for watching.